Kind of Obama.
Looks like a goblin.
He looks really mad. He looks really mad about that hamburger.
He really does look mad about it.
I like Obama. I voted for him. Okay, this looks correct. So, if you go to Canvas, you can go to Files and find a quick start guide to UV unwrapping. And if you have models done, I encourage you to follow along with yours. Otherwise, you can just use, say, a cylinder or a torus. That's going to be enough that we can start doing things. Maybe give it some extra subdivisions on the height. So UV unwrapping is that idea that we covered very briefly in class last week of how to get a 2D spaced representation of this object as it's flattened out. And most of this we end up doing through the UV texture editor window. You can see it. Many of the basic objects in Maya, when created, actually have starting UVs already cut for you. Such as the cylinder. If you did a cube, if you did a torus cylinder, they would have other things that you could see. The first thing I want to change here is actually some of the draw modes that are going to give us a better idea of where these UVs are. And you can see on that quick start guide, a lot of them are marked up here. So the first one we're going to turn on is where the cuts are, which is this little button here. Everyone see that? And this is where your UV seams are. A lot of times we're going to be doing this in edge mode. So just keep that in mind. And you'll notice that this changed how our cylinder looks all of a sudden. We can tell that this cap is separate and this cap is separate. Yes. And that we can see the seam is right here. So again, seams are something that are kind of interesting, and sometimes you need to hide them. So if this was, say, an arm, I would put that seam on the underside of his arm so that because that arm is almost always closed or close to his body, you wouldn't see it as much. The next draw mode we're going to add to see these a little better is actually this one, which is going to show us the UV shading as separate objects. A lot of times when you have a texture, it's very hard to know if you're looking at edges or faces. And so by turning this on, we can see some sort of contrast from this. I don't know why Maya starts with these turned off. I wish they were the default. And the next one we're going to turn on is down here. It's the little checkerboard, which is a starting checkerboard. And the reason for this checkerboard is that it can show a lot of distortions. So if these faces were taking up more space in this UV editor, they would have more checkers in them, and so we would know that their ratio is wrong. So right off the bat, what can we tell? We can tell that although this square is about the right size there, this is getting distorted. So if this is lacking distortion, these would be entirely square, but instead they have this sort of stretch going on them. So let's try and fix that as a basic UV problem. What's up?
Oh, how do you get it to be all colorful like that?
I turned on the UV grid, which is right here, the little checkerboard.
Okay, it's not doing that on mine.
Well then, that is weird. Another thing you might want to do is... So if that's not working, let's take a quick segue into the basics of materials. Just go to Google. And a lot of times people prefer this because they don't like Maya's UV grid. But you can just search UV grid. And the first images are all going to be images that can give you the same idea.
Okay.
So you can right click, save this as, just UVs. Now let's take a quick segue into materials. If you right click over your object while in object mode, one of the most frequent things you go to in Maya is actually down here, the material attributes. And this will bring up this panel in which you can see the material that you're using. This is Lambert 1, which is the default material that Maya starts for all objects. You don't want to ever modify Lambert 1 so So the first thing we have to do is put a different material on this.
Got it figured out. I had to display my job.
Alright, well then screw materials. So you know nothing of materials yet. Back to UVs.
Alright.
So we can tell that this is distorted, and we can actually kind of see it. These polygons are really, really long here, but they're not that long here. So we would want to scale this just like we would scale a 3D object or 3D faces. And the way we're going to do this is by selecting UV shells. Once you have good UVs, shell selection is one of the best ways to select things in Maya. A lot of times it'll be like you have an object such as a character's head, and their hair is a separate chunk of mesh than the face, but it's all one object. And so you can use UV shells to very quickly select all the hair or all the face. If you right click now over your object, you get your selection menu, right? If you go to UV, it'll change to a new set, which is UVs or UV shell. And if I go to UV shell, you'll notice that it changes how these are selected. And it gives you a really nice hover representation of that. I think this is one of the reasons people don't like Maya's UV grid is it's actually very hard to tell the difference between a selected face and what's just checkerboarded. But anyways, I'm going to select that UV face. And over here in the UV texture editor, you can use W, E, and R to bring up the same things that you normally use. And I can scale this until perhaps it looks a little less distorted. Now in the UV grid, you have this area that goes in this basic corner. And usually when you create a new object and it has default UVs created, it'll start within that. That's sort of the area that your texture is going to end up being. But you end up using a lot of this other space as sort of workplace area. So if you were unwrapping an object, a lot of times the thing you do is you turn all the UVs to basic versions. Then you take all of them off the screen. Then you select the one chunk you want to unwrap at a time, such as a boot. Unwrap it, get it correct, and move it into this grid. Then you select the next selection that's incorrect, unwrap that, and move it, so on and so forth. So by scaling this, you'll see that we can start to get these faces a little more accurate. I think I'm just going to get it as wide as possible. That works. So we never completely solved it, but now we're getting a lot less distortion. How much distortion do we have? Well, we can actually check with another draw menu option. So I'm going to turn off the checkerboard and instead click this option next to my display shapes, which is going to be the distortion representer. And what this does is it's going to color objects the more distorted the UVs are. So in that metaphor of the orange, we're sort of choosing between multiple things. Do we want more cuts on the orange, which then you can see the cut sometimes, or in texture land you have to fix that. Or do we want more distortion by having this something like this? And you'll notice that if I grab one of these single UVs, I went right click to UV mode, I just selected one. As I add distortion, the color changes. So just keep that in mind. That's something that you want to check. That's more important when you start getting into organic stuff and a more complex model.
Did you check that again?
It's right next, it's the one that is like the rainbow gradient, display UV distortion, right here.
Oh, okay.
So depending on where you want to make these orange cuts, you can have a very different object. You could have it by hemisphere, a sort of equatorial cut, and then you have the top of the earth and the bottom of the cut. Or you could have the thing where like you cut a little bit on the edge and more and more and more, and distort it that way. And if you create a cylinder, or a sphere, it's let's go into UV mode on this. And you'll notice that that's how it's immediately cut. The default square, the default sphere, cuts towards this sort of pole on the top and bottom of it. Or in its default normal setting in Maya, the left and right side. I don't know why they do that. And this is one where we're also having a little bit of distortion. And you'll notice that part of the problem here is that as something approaches the pole, it's getting smaller and smaller area on the 3D object, but it's staying the same in the 2D grid. So if we turn on distortion, you can sort of see that. See, these are too wide and these are too small, or too thin. But that's one of those, creative or intelligent choices you have to make, is where your distortion is going to happen and where your cuts are going to happen. Both cause different problems. Now let's say you hand modeled something that was cylindrical, such as a human face, right? So let's say I had all these. So let's say I'm just riffing here. Gorgeous human head, right? So beautiful. It's extruding. This is what your models look like if you box model. Alright, so there's your human head, right? You'll notice that as I extruded those things in, there were changes to my UV editor, and it's not good. And this is why you sort of want to do UVs at the end of a project usually. Once you get all your modeling done, you generally have to start from a blank canvas of just get it all to the side, it's all garbage, and then manually move it forward. So for something like this, let's start by going to edit UVs. No. Create. I'm going to sew all the UV edges. And you'll see that now there's nothing. And I'm going to move. And now I have to select where these are going to get cut. So now we can start manually trying to cut this orange in a way that's going to be more pleasing for art reasons. So if you had this as your face, you would probably want the cut going around the back rather than the front, because you can have hair covering a lot of that seam. And also, you can end up, I don't know, you don't look at the back of somebody's head as much. And the other thing you might start finding is that if you have a more detailed mesh that has a mouth that goes inwards, that's a good place where, because there's no way to fully get that mouth into a single unwrap, you might put a new seam around the lip line so that the inner mouth is a separate object. But for this, let's just go like this. I'll select from there, go to here. Something like that. Now if this is where I want my orange seam, again I went to edit UVs, sew UV edges with everything selected to say there was no UV edges on this first. I can now go edit UVs, cut UV edges. And that's going to add this as a new cut. After you do this, you kind of have to test the distortion. And the way we do that is, I'm going to go to the shell, so we can select this whole thing. And you're going to go shift right click. No, control right. Let me check my guide. What is it? Oh, I think it's up here. So you go edit UVs, unfold. Oh, polygon, unfold.
Did you count them?
Thought I did. Oh, there. Shift right click and go to the smooth UV tool. That's not in my guide, sorry. And this one gives you these two little boxes down here, which are unfold and relax. Oh, it does do that. It's the same thing as right here. Oh yeah, I said it right here. UV selected, Shift RMB, smooth UV tools. So this is the basis for most organic unwrapping. And you're sort of going between two choices. Unfold is going to smooth to fit your existing UV borders. We don't want that because right now they're garbage, right? And relax is going to try and shift the UV borders to have the least amount of distortion overall. So if I grab left click on relax and yank it down, it's going to go crazy, right? You can kind of go back and forth. Ew. Eventually you get to this sort of area where you have to. This is sort of like a jigsaw puzzle in that then you can try and find where your stuff is. So we're having some problem where the eyes are not unwrapping, right? UV. I think layout is actually the first button you want. And then shift right click, tweak UV. No, shift right click. Gotta be in UV mode. Smooth UV tool. No, it's not working. Well, that's why sometimes you want to use the basic tools like cylindrical mapping. So when you use one of the basic ones, planar mapping, cylindrical mapping, spherical mapping, oftentimes it's confusing because when you start off, so let's say I have all my faces selected, create UV cylindrical mapping, you get this weird widget. This widget ends up representing how the cylinder unwraps this. And the first thing you have to do is modify how it's deforming. And it's this little T machine that changes it. This changes between sort of outer versus object controls. I don't know if that makes sense. So that toggles between different ways of functioning. And then, sort of when you have the transform polygons tool, you have all three transform types here. You just have to manually select them. So if I click on this to get these, I can hover over this and click on this, and it's going to switch to the rotation tool by using this little thing. So now I can start rotating this so that the cylinder lines up with our head. And you can manually type that in. You can also scale it down. And that's starting to get to cylindrical levels. It's not going to be perfect because at this point, if we were going to do this, we would want this whole top to possibly be a separate cap. So one thing I do a lot for the purpose of just quick and dirty unwrapping is I actually really like using the create UVs based on the camera tool. Because oftentimes you're operating in things where you're at like a 45-degree angle, and you know that you want this as one giant chunk, say the roof of your building. So you can just hover over the top and say, hey, create UVs based on camera. You'd move them off. You'd do these. Same thing. I hit G for repeat last command. Now I can select everything that's not those problem ones. And symmetrical unwrap. Get to rotation, and then rotate this on the x-axis. Let's see. So if you have all these, next up you need to do is get these into a single plane, or into this texture grid, right? And there's a couple of ways to do this. Again, this is on my handy cheat sheet if you want. These two, normalize and unitize, are different ways of getting this to fit back into this total box. Normalize will distort them to make them fit, whereas unitize will assume that your unwraps are the amount of distortion you want. You just now need to get all these in. So then you would go edit UVs, unitize. Alright, nope, unitize resets everything. I was wrong. So yeah, use normalize.
Is there a setting in Normalize where you think it doesn't distort it?
I think if you, oh, I think this is the one I'm on. No. Unitize UVs. There we are. Layout UVs, I think, does it. So let's look at some weird edge cases, because UV unwrapping is something that can get very, very complex and interesting. And a lot of times they'll do things like alpha cards. And what alpha cards are is, imagine some guy with Final Fantasy hair. You'd actually have thousands of polygons for his hair that are each individual cards. But they're all sharing the exact same UV space of a hair texture. And then layered together, they create this thing that looks like a unique 3D object. Let me show you that weird alien I've been working on. So if you look at his body, it's got some really interesting UV things going on. So this is a weird case where each of these is sort of a separate object, and he's got all these Evangelion things. And there's all sorts of little polygons that oh shit. So, for instance, you can see where the cuts are on here. This is sort of a separate chunk, and then there's all these rivets, or rivulets, and those would sort of be a separate problem. So you'll see what I did is I ended up getting all of these flat things in one area, and then all of these other ones actually just have all their polygons off screen. And the reason is because in theory, the final choice is going to be putting a different material on these rivets. Just because they would be so hard to deal with and so much distortion. And you'll notice that that also lets me focus on trying to pack all of these in individually. And that was the other reason, is because these are all so separate, there's not as much need to keep it in total form. The one downside of this is that it's going to be a bitch to paint if I was trying to paint this by hand, because I wouldn't be able to say that this is torso, therefore this is torso. I don't know, maybe I would unwrap it so that I do keep these seams here. But the thing that's really fun about this is so imagine this is unwrapped to a texture. The problem with it is there's something called MIP mapping. And what MIP mapping is 3D trying to figure out how to make pixels blend. And so if this is equating to 16 pixels, that's fine. And all of a sudden this is something else. And this is, say, 2 pixels wide. All of a sudden it's going to start having blending problems. And so by having these be separate, I can also maintain what I wanted, which is sort of really defined separations by assigning a different material. Oh man. Pardon me. I used Maya for the last week, and oh, my Blender hotkeys are bad. And there's other ways that you end up using this. So if you have a Photoshop texture that's 512 by 512 or something, you can end up having a layout in longer. This is sort of just high theory right now. But you can have a layout that ends up being something you can hand off to any other person, and it'll work. So let's say you have this 512 by 512 texture. You can start to do things like divide it up. So I'm going to use the slice tool. Divide, slice into 2 by 2. Yeah. And then we could have something like, you could have as your sort of slice logic that this is head, this is torso, head and torso are really big, so maybe that they take up this whole chunk. And over here you have pants, boot, glove, accessory, and hair. Something like that. And so what you have now is you could be just the head guy on the project and work on this 256 by 256 texture, and then eventually it gets assembled into this larger idea. So a lot of times you can do stuff like that. There's also an issue of distortion in that let's actually try using this other object. I'm going to segue into some basics of materials for Maya. Let's say this is our head, right? And we want to start having a texture on it. The first thing we're going to do is look at the basics of adding materials in Maya. So if you right-click and get this window, one of the options is assign new material or assign favorite material. I would actually prefer that you guys stick with the favorite materials here of Surface Shader through Blend. And the reason is, if you go and do what everyone else does, which is you go to Mental Ray, MIA, Material X, and then you go to the Material X panel, right click, Material Attributes, and then you go to Preset, and you just load 50% chrome or 50% copper. The problem is you're losing the fact that the majority of the work you want to be focusing on is textural. And secondly, you're going to be getting into channels and stuff that deals with Mental Ray. And actually, I think Mental Ray is kind of dying. I think it's legacy. If you guys want to be ambitious and do your program or your project in a different physically based render, look up Pixar's RenderMan.
I just got it's free now.
It's free. It's free for non-commercial use. So this is a physically based render, and it's what Pixar uses. And they have documentation online. I've been playing with it at home. And if this is free, why the fuck is anyone ever going to use Mental Ray again? Mental Ray is like from the 1990s. It's awful. You can go to documentation, and I don't think it's installed on these computers, but they certainly have a ton of stuff. Look at this. And they have downloadable demo files that you can look at as well. So, to some extent, the reason that I don't want you using these MIAX materials or fancy mental ray shaders is because I believe that at some point we're mostly going to be taking the scene into Unity, or you're going to be using in your professional life physically based renderers or non-physically based renderers that are something other than mental ray. It's good to see some of the theory behind, say, using nodes in mental ray, but for the most part I'd like you to stick with these favorite materials. Let's talk about what they are actually. So I will right click, assign new material of Blinn, and if you look, there's a couple of differences here. So Blinns are a shiny material in this, and this is not a physically based renderer, this is software, so it's going to be very basic, but the good thing about this is it means we can focus more on texturing to get our good looks rather than a renderer just automatically making it look good. Any given material has all these various attributes, and I'll go over them briefly. Color refers to, basically, it's diffuse color, and in painting this is called the local color. Imagine you have a green apple. Green is its local color. If you shine a red light on it, it's going to not look green, and in the render it might even come up straight gray. In fact, oftentimes if you color pick off of a shot of a movie, you'll have trees or shadows that in your mind you think the trees are green and the shadows are black, but when you color pick it's going to be a sort of orangish tree and a purplish shadow. And so that's an example of local color being destroyed by its environment lighting. So it's sort of the first step that you have, and if this was perfectly neutral light, that's what the color would be. Transparency is exactly what it sounds like, how transparent it is. Ambient color refers to how much of this is sort of glowing, and this is different from a material that actually does glow, but it's a good starting basis. Incandescence is also that. Bump mapping is how you end up making this look like it has more polygons than it does. We talked briefly about normal maps, and later on when we get into texturing we're going to talk about that more. But that's where you use bump mapping. And then diffuse light is sort of like if you crank all these back down. Diffuse light, using that idea of the tree getting lit, that determines to some extent how much of it is affected by the environment light. So something that has lots of scraggly textural detail like carpet is going to be lower in diffusion because it has all these carpet fibers that absorb the light, and as a result it's not going to accept as much light. When you get down to here, the specular shading, these mostly just change how the light source affects it. The main one we're going to be looking at for texture is specular color. No, not specular color. Reflectivity. I think it's reflectivity, which determines how much of this is affected or not. Actually, maybe it's specular roll-off. Again, I hate this about Maya. Everyone has like normal words that they say in video game land, which is the specular map. And Maya still doesn't just say where to put that. A Lambert shader is the other one that you might want to look at. Let's bring the ambient color back up. Not the ambient color, the diffuse color. So the main difference between a Lambert and a Blinn is how shiny it is. Lamberts don't have a shine on them. And one thing to note is that if everything in the world has some variance amount of shininess, oftentimes what you end up doing is having this Blinn, and you just crank down the eccentricity to 0, and that's essentially a Lambert. So it never hurts to just use Blinns for everything, except in terms of render time. So that's like a very bare bones idea of what materials are. Everybody following along? Okay. So let's talk about how to get a texture on this. All these different material properties, when we look at them, have these little checkerboard swatches next to them, and that's the button to add an input. If you click on this, you get a new window that says what kind of inputs you want. There's a million options that nobody ever chooses, and you shouldn't choose them either. The main one that you end up choosing is a file, and that points to an image texture. File. And this brings up a new node. Again, Maya is very node oriented, so if I click out of that and I instead go back to this object here, first off, this ugly human face that I made has a lot of different leftover inputs, so I'm going to get rid of those just so we can focus on our material ones by going to Edit, Delete All by Type, History. And now if I go to my attributes, all I see are the blend material I created and a cube. And you'll notice that it's all black now, and that's because there's no file here. So now you can see that this is a node that exists on this object. And inside of that material node is a file node, which points to a file. And inside of that file node is a place2D texture node that says where it is. You can actually see these connections in the Hypershade, Window, General Editors, no. Rendering Editors, Hypershade. This is just a connection viewer to some extent. I think they even have a connection editor. So if I have this object selected, and I click this button, which is Input and Output Connections, it'll graph this, and we can see these in a more visual representation of what Pokemon are on our belt, right? We got a polycylinder shape, which goes into a blend, which goes into there. If I select this blend node and click the same button, graph inputs and outputs, it'll give you something else, which is, oh, it's connected to these objects. It's going outward towards this polygon cylinder, or that's an input. The blend is in a shading group, which connects to this blend as one of the blends in it. And there's a file going to that, and a place2D texture node affecting that. Oftentimes this is useful to have open just because it's a way to select these same nodes, and it's a little faster than trying to find it in the channel editor. But again, if you're ever lost, just right click on your object and go back to Material Attributes, and that'll take you to your material node. And then you can click through these inputs and outputs to find the file node. So let's actually try loading a file in here. I'll click on the little file icon and go to the desktop where I saved that UV grid. And nothing happens. Oh God, I'm the worst teacher ever. No, there's a reason that didn't happen. And the reason is we have to turn on our texturing. I think it's 6 turns on textures? Yeah. So we can start to see a little bit of the problem here with MIP mapping. Let's open this file up in Photoshop. You'll notice that it's starting to blur this a little bit, right? In Photoshop, it's a hard pixel. But over here, it's MIP blurring it to try and make it, less noticeable how pixely this is. When you're texturing things, a good tip is to always go through and sharpen things in preparation for MIP mapping. We know that it's going to blur all this on the 3D end, and there's ways to turn it off. However, a lot of times you do actually want it. But if you go through, you can fix that. So looking back at this guy, what if I assign something on his whole body? Let's just add a new material. I'm just operating in Blender because I can go faster and not demo effect, but the principles are the same. Whee. So here you can see this texture and the problem of bitmap on something that's a little more interesting. But you'll also notice the various ways that differing unwrap modes can make things interesting. So for instance, now I can do something like select all those polygons that are in this group that I made of this horrible area. I could say, this is something I do a lot, which is I'll shrink them down to nothing. And because now I scaled all these down to one thing, I can sort of manually choose our sort of highlight color. You guys get what I'm saying? The main point I'm trying to get across here is that you can actually be quite creative with unwrapping. And it goes back to that don't repeat yourself principle. A good example might be this pauldron that he has on. These sort of cylinders coming out are an interesting shape, right? So you might think, oh, I don't want to repeat myself, so I'll model one, and then I'll duplicate it. But actually, you're going to have to repeat yourself now because you have to unwrap all three of those. So one thing you might do is unwrap one of these, and then once you have the whole thing done as like a whole sort of concept, you can move it out. And then they're going to share UV spaces, which means you have more space for texturing, and so on and so forth. Right? Does anyone have objects they're struggling to unwrap? You want to take more of a look?
A wheel.
A wheel. So a wheel is interesting in that...
Actually, I tied more specifically with treads.
Yeah. That's one of those interesting things where you might end up wanting to do it procedurally. So let's say I do this. It's sort of hard to represent all this cylinder of tire in one go, right? Because this track is going to be repeating, right? So oftentimes it might be something that's a little more beneficial. I'm going to try and make this a bit more difficult to start with. So let's bevel this. Where's bevel? So for this, a wheel is kind of an interesting idea of how, and it also shows the ways that you can be creative, because this tire tread might be something that, I mean, maybe you want it to be an entire unwrap where it's like this, but you can actually start thinking about ways that you can save texture space. And if this is a tire tread that's like this, maybe you want to just have one unwrap like this for all of them. And then that repeats over the whole thing. So you might end up doing something like, let me think. If I were to do this straight off, I would probably start with a cylinder unwrap. And we're going to look at this in the UV editor. So first things first, I need to see which faces I'm actually unwrapping. Again, I want to keep drilling you on good modeling techniques and selection techniques. I select this one face, I shift, double click on this one, and it selects the whole ring. I shift select this one to add the selection, I shift double click to add the whole thing. And now I can actually shift period to grow selection, and shift period to grow selection. So this is sort of the area that we want unwrapped, right? With that selected, create UVs, cylindrical mapping. This is definitely incorrect. I wish this showed up better on the screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is, oh, actually it is correct. So one problem that happens here is you'll notice that it actually did a really good job of this, in that this is now a separate chunk. I'm going to move this off screen so we don't have to deal with it. And now we have all these, but the problem is these rings are sort of flattened down into oblivion. So we can actually just I'm going to select this and this. I'm going to convert my edge selection that I just made into UVs with shift right click, control right click, 2 UVs. And now I can see that it's selecting some of the UVs that I want, including these ones up here, but some that I don't want, which are the ones in this middle ring. So now I can deselect with control and left click. Can I? Oh, screw it. We'll just start the starting face. Actually, I'll do it from the start. Control right click, 2 UVs. And I'll scale these. I'll turn on my grid so I can tell the distortion. And now once I know that I have that, I can get rid of these faces. So now these sort of represent a perfect tire tread, right? But you can actually get even more into it by going to face mode. And we can start to try and break these up. I'll turn off the grid. And I want to see these like that. So let's say I want this to be something that's 2 rows of polygons wide every time, like that. You can do that. Give me a moment while I demo effect, trying to remember which one I want. Cut UV edges? No. There we go. Split UVs. Just like with modeling, you can actually use various snap tools. So I'm going to use V to snap to there. Now I can select these. Now I can snap to there. Now I can snap to here. Now I can snap to here. And you can get way too into this. I mean, like the thing I was saying about triangles, this is one of those areas that you should learn to look at it and say, oh, that looks good, so I'll stop now. And otherwise you'll say, does the UVs look good? But the UVs are just a means to an end, right? And I will oftentimes waste way too much of my life trying to get these perfect. And it's not worth it. Case in point, I don't know if this was actually worthwhile. Oh, I wanted to show. Oh, shit. just as a segue of other ways of unwrapping, I think the head is a good example of this. On this, I'm going to turn off all this normal fur. You'll see that I unwrapped this in a very specific way. I tried to keep this with as little seams as possible, but also as little distortion as possible. This guy has something that is not a human equivalent. A human head is basically a cylinder. I mean, like, yes, our chin juts out a little bit, but really it just bleeds right into your neck. This guy has ears that come way out. He has a mouth that goes way in. He's got this sort of prehistoric sloth tusk. And so where do I put these UVs? Well, this ends up being one whole chunk for the mouth. But you'll notice that if I didn't have this tongue unwrap, it would end up looking really wrong. And you can see how this... So imagine I just do the equivalent of the create UVs based on camera by going like this. If I didn't unwrap the tongue separately, we would have to fit all the tongue's UVs into this tiny little space, and there would be a lot of distortion. So the tongue ends up being a separate object. The top of his head ends up being something I chose, and this was sort of a creative decision unique to this this project. Every time you have seams, that introduces an area that you might get a problem where when you're texturing, you have to manually fix it, and that is really, really sucky to do. So I ended up doing this because it sort of follows this head ridge, right? It wraps around the ear. And I imagine that this can unwrap. It kind of takes a little work, but it does sort of fold outward. And you'll notice that different things take up different space. Note how this head versus this mouth. The mouth takes up a lot less area than it actually does in polygon space. If we had a UV grid on this, you would see that it would have much larger squares than the upper part of its head. And the reason is because the mouth is less important. A lot of times this creature might have its mouth closed. So that's another one of those creative decisions. If something is not going to be as visible, you can actually shrink the UVs a little bit more. And then lastly, this bottom part was specifically because I decided, you know what, there's this seam where these two tusks meet, so I guess we can have a front seam. And the tusks are frequently going to be blocking your view of the neck, so maybe it's not as bad. But it's too hard to have it wrap around, and I want to be able to have this look like something kind of like the front of the face being at the center of it. So I ended up doing it right there. And then lastly, I have just smaller areas where I can dump things like teeth or eyeballs. So I could put the eyeballs down here on that texture. So let's go back to that tire. So by doing all of these, I could actually have a tiny strip of tire. And let's actually try making it. One thing I like doing is using Create PSD Network. This is another feature that's fun, but it only works with the basic textures. But it's good for organization's sake. You have to be in object mode. First off, you specify where it's going to go. This is going to be in the source images directory of wherever I set my project to. It's going to be 1024 by 1024. Including the UV snapshot is something that is going to aid us. This is going to take a snapshot of the UVs, many of which are off screen, and include it as a layer, and we'll be able to paint under it and understand where our tire tread ends up. And then lastly, we have to select what sort of attributes we're going for. So one thing I'm going to do first is I'm going to delete this. I'm going to not do it because I just noticed something, which is if I go to the material attributes, this is still on Lambert 1. That's the default material. We don't want to start fucking with that, freaking with that. So instead, I will assign a blend to this. And fine naming conventions. I actually kind of disagree with a major thought of lots of artistic instruction in the game industry, which is everyone stresses to students you have to have naming conventions. Naming convention, naming. And yeah, that's important, but like it's not like a core artistic concept. It's not like a hard thing to grasp that requires lots of study. Eventually, you're just gonna have a boss who tells you to do it, and you'll do it. You don't have to like learn it in school. You should be learning about faithful rendering and cool technology rather than naming conventions. This is why I suck at programming. So now I'm going to go image, create PSD network. And we have all these attributes. And again, all these are representations of where this color node, like if I clicked here and added a file, this is going to create a PSD network that basically creates this for many, many channels at once. So I could say color, I could say bump, I could say a tire is going to have maybe more shininess on the upper part of the tread than the lower tread, so God, I never remember what it is. It's like reflectivity, I think it's the one I want. And let's say create. And that creates this 2D texture. So now if you, let's look at the material before we actually open it up. In the material attributes, you'll notice that a node has been added for all of these. And if we look at it in our hyper shade, we can sort of see under the hood of how this is connecting to different things. Rendering, hyper shade. I'm going to go back to my material. Here's something that's good to know in Maya. A lot of times I keep saying that these objects have nodes attached. Well, those nodes basically are object-oriented in terms of like, I mean, you know, you guys, you kids with your cell phones and your Pokemons, you're doing programming in high school, right? I didn't have that luxury. I grew up on a rural farm picking apples. And I had to walk 6 miles to play Pokemon. So this node is out there, and it's an object, and you can select an object at any time by going down here and clicking select. And so now this material is quote-unquote selected. And that means that because it's selected, I mean, it's hard to understand why it's selected or how we could visually see it selected. But under the hood, we just clicked select, so that's sort of loaded right now. If I now click the input and out connection, it'll map that, and we can see how it's connecting this. So it has this specific sort of PSD file, and it connected all these. And it's doing an extra node for this bump map, which we're going to get to later. And let's open up this file. I believe if we go through here, we can actually, in this node, so if I'm in my material attributes and I click through these inputs and outputs, eventually I get to this point where I can hit edit. And it should open up Photoshop, and it'll have this file all set up for us. There's a UV snapshot layer, so we can see where I made this tire tread. It's got channels for reflectivity, bump, and tire color. And in theory, we put some garbage over here. So now, we Google, I don't know, tire tread. Cool. Let me just grab shit off of Google Maps like a professional, right? Yeah. There's something that's bigger than that. Search tools. Size, large. We want something like this. I'm going with this tire because it specifically has very little perspective distortion, and it has very sort of neutral light. So if I take a swatch from like here to here, it should line up. So right click, copy image, real professional of me. And this is actually a fun place to try using Krita maybe. So I'll paste this, I'll rotate it. I'm going to put this down here in my tire color layer, and I'll turn off my bump and reflectivity for now. Scaling unevenly, like everyone else says not to. That looks about right. But I'm actually going to take this into a different program shortly, so we can look at something fun. I'm trying to distort this so that both down here and up here, both of these go through a specific thing. That's pretty good, right? Now with this UV snapshot, I can actually just sort of either wand outside of it and invert, Control-Shift-I. Here's an advanced selection lesson. Magic wand, select outside of this, Control-Shift-I to invert selection. I'm going to copy this. I'll paste it here. Edit. This is sort of advanced. Maybe I shouldn't be showing you this. Oh well. This is how I would do it. I mean, this is sort of the fun thing about 3D art, right? Is you get to experiment and try out new techniques. And actually develop pipeline ideas. If I have this selected, I will save. I'm going to save this to the desktop as a ping. PNG and Targas are lossless, so they are recommended for use. This is just something I'm saving temporarily, so I can open it as a pattern in Krita. Who here's tried Krita? So Krita is free and open source, and I don't know if it works on this computer. I think we tried this last time and it had sadness.
Any outside software that's not already on there, you have to like go talk to tech support, because if you try to put it on there, it'll just go in the default.
I messaged.
It's on here.
Is it on there?
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, I messaged them over the break and said, please install this.
It's on my computer.
I've just had trouble opening it in the past. Anyways,
Oh, there it is. Yeah, I'm done. Okay.
is anyone else getting it to open?
Oh,
Is it doing this for you too? Alright. Alright, for now this is fine.
Oh yeah, it's telling me that too.
Well here, let's actually just save this right now. See how it looks in Maya. Look at that, instant tire. Woo! So I was going to show you a way to clean this sort of thing up. So that's how I would make a tire. And you'll notice that, yes, you could have had this just be that straight across thing, but now you have a lot more texture space that you can use on more valuable things. You might be able to just clean this up by hand. So the problem area that we're coming across, sort of right here, where this little thing comes in. Here's the healing brush. You guys know how the healing brush works?
Yeah, you just use the clone stamp and take it to the tire.
If you want to get real dope, really skilled. You guys want to smoke some skill? Am I recording? Uh-oh. We should actually consider eschewing this land of, grabbing textures and putting photos in and baking textures out, and actually try hand painting some stuff on your models. That's what they do for all the Warcraft stuff, and that's why it has this unreplicable look. You can't just bake that out. And I think League of Legends does a lot of that too.
That's why they pride themselves in their characters in front of matter.
Huh?
That they like to do that, and that's why they like to do characters all the time, is because that's where they get most of their money.
Yeah.
By doing a lot.
And let's be honest, like, that's sort of the fun aspect of a video game. And I think that it's a good gaming model because it allows you to commoditize characters a lot. The same reason that like Pokemon is good and Skylanders is good is because you just make one new character and it's a sellable thing. Nobody buys like a new environment as a toy at the toy store. You collect action figures, not play sets.
I would.
Get out of my class!
Well, people do buy, like, levels.
That's true.
But the one thing, I don't know if this is off track, but with the Infinity, there's so many animators I know that don't play the game, but they buy
Yeah.
the figurines.
Infinity is another example. Like,
They're so well made, now they're getting crappier. But before they
So Pizza didn't open for me.
Yeah, it took way too long.
Yeah, game pad.
okay, I'll message them.
I think they put it on, but I don't think they actually like.
Oh, look at that sad anti-installation. Dream.
Oh, backwards. Oh, wow.
I know.
I've never seen that.
Well, the specific thing I wanted to show you, if you ever are doing this, and I know that you do this a lot in 3D, is you're trying to make tileable textures, or even like just that little swatch you might want tileable. Look up Krita OpenGL tiling. There might be a video of this.
When you use Maya on your own, do you use a tablet, or you on a pen and tablet?
I don't use on my own. I use Blender.
I never mind.
Mine on a pen and tablet, like some people do it, but it's just super confusing.
How do you figure
They are brave people. It's not the kind of program you need to
Yeah, I mean,
Kind of used to it.
the thing about 3D is a lot of times you end up having this issue of precision where you're moving around and then you find the spot and then you stop and then you click. And that's sort of an anti-tablet workflow, because with tablets, as you click down, you're going to move off of that spot. So precision selection is kind of harder with a tablet. So I usually avoid it for that reason.
Like it was not working, like I haven't set it up that way yet, just because it's being like with the middle mouse button and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
it's a lot.
Yeah, you have to like.
Yeah, wait, so Oscar, how did you get
The repeating.
inside the UVs? How you had that like one little strip of like UVs and then just like.
First off, I'm going to smooth my nose. See, this is where you would end up using OpenGL tiling, just to fix like that little seam.
Wait, so you just had it repeat?
So what I did is, let's see if I can do it again real fast. First I had this torus. Alright. So I just undid all my UV edges.
Yeah, no.
If I cylindrically unwrap this, looks pretty good. The first thing I need to do, and I can see this with UV Texture Editor open, and perhaps this, is I need to fix this distortion, where these faces basically got baked down to 0. Maya kind of is not the most friendly at this, but with the right workflow you can work around it. What I was trying to do earlier was select just the UVs on this side of these edges and not these inner ones, but it won't let me do that. But I can actually, since they're currently connected, I can just scale this and it'll fix that. Do you see how that happened? And then if I turn the grid off and I turn texturing off, these are the faces I had selected, so when I scaled them it pulled out from here to here. And then I can separate these. we'll do another cylinder map and yank these up. So now these are a separate object. So now with these as a full-on object, I wanted to move these in strips of 2 over. And
Oh, yeah.
so if I select all these faces, any people about to graduate know if there's a way to like just break off these faces or separate them but keep their own map?
You could extract them, I guess.
I mean, like that's what, you know, it's such a here's the thing in Blender.
You can extract faces.
Yeah, you can extract.
As in like to a separate model and then combine them again.
No, I mean like it'll just make a different shell.
Where's that? Edit UVs, extract face.
Or you can also cut along the edge. Separate it that way. Oh, we
Yeah,
can-
I mean you can cut along UV edges, move this out.
Yeah, just simply the problem with that.
If you go face mode, then you select the faces you want, and then you right click, and then say, or go to edit mesh or whatever one it is, and then say extract. It'll usually give you like a different selection in that mesh, and then that's how you can get like other textures or stuff. If that's what you're trying to do.
As a separate mesh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not in the UV menu. It would be in the.
Yeah, it's the polygon one. You know, it just makes me angry. So, anyways, I have these as faces now. And I want these to be entirely cut. Split UV. Why aren't they separating?
It would be under the mesh menu, I think.
Oh, there we go. So now these are separate. And you need to get these connected back onto these. So you can use vert snap actually to get them back on top. And then similarly, now I just select all these, I vert snap over here. So I'm holding V while I do this. And now I have these. It's a separate thing. Now what's cool is now you can do procedural UV editing. So we have this tire here, right? We can actually, now that we have these correct, check this out. You can say more tire or less tire just by going like that.
Or like how many treads you want.
Yeah, how much tread you want.
Interesting. So you can make different tires that way without even having to.
Yeah.
create other-
And again, this is our, you know, it's UVs, let's be honest, it sucks. No one likes UVs. It's a means to an end. But you can get, there are aspects of it that can get really weird and creative. Actually going to delete this one.
So what that UV is doing with the whole like strip is just taking that one part of the tire and
Yeah.
applying it to the whole tire.
Yeah. I'm going to duplicate this over to an instance so we can see it on this one as we work on the other one. So now what's happening is as we go like this, we add more tread. As we go like this, we're sort of choking up on the. So just like how when we scaled up and therefore with the UV grid we saw more texture, you can do the same thing with these. And people will model whole cityscapes doing this where you just have one giant polygon representing the side of the building and you can scale it more or less over a single texture that represents a wall with a doorway and some, you know, ridges on it. And the more you scale it, the bigger the building is in scale because you'll have more of those doorways and more floors and so on and so forth. So there's your tire. with some slight transparency. Alright, we're going to take a quick break. When I get back, we're going to talk a little bit about extracting textures from other textures to make normal maps, and more on that theory of normal maps, and just a bare bones level of what you stick in those frickin' channels, right? Alright. Open broadcasters.